This video is brought to you by ASRock. Yes, thank you ASRock. And the Z490 Tai-Chi 10th generation Intel Core processors have been announced, and this motherboard supports the 10th generation processors that have been announced. Can't say much about performance yet, but I can tell you about ASRock's wonderful new Z490 Tai-Chi motherboard. So first up, you got the 10th generation CPU support, which of course means that you're going to have insane massive power delivery. That's Dr. Moss. 60 amp power choke, 60 amp power delivery. And you may be thinking, wait, didn't I see this kind of power delivery subsystem on an extremely high-end motherboard? And you would be correct. Yes, indeed you did. Yes, because this motherboard can deliver a whole bunch of power. And also Nahimic Audio. Nahimic Audio is a high-end audio solution. It's a high-end implementation of the Realtek ALC 1220 for nice, clean, powerful amplification to be able to drive those studio headphones or whatever it is that you might be plugging into it. So if you're considering building a computer based around Intel's 10th generation core CPUs, you should check out the Z490 Tai-Chi, link below. Thanks ASRock. On with the interview. Guess what? I've got an interview. I'm joined with Hayden Barnes. He is here. He's the developer advocate for Ubuntu, the WSL system for Ubuntu, I guess is how you would say that.
It's Ubuntu on WSL, yes.
Ubuntu on WSL. See, it confuses me because it's like the Windows subsystem for Linux, and it's like, well, the words seem backwards from what my brain intrinsically expects, and then I think about it, and it's like, oh no, okay, yeah, it can mean that. It's like flammable versus inflammable. I don't know.
Right. It's the subsystem of Windows to run Linux. And
yes.
It actually comes down to a trademark issue. Microsoft couldn't start a product with Linux before it actually had the kernel in it. So
that makes sense, I guess. WSL2 is still pretty hot news because there's been a lot of changes from WSL1, a lot of changes for the better, and that will be something fun to sort of talk about. There are a lot of people that I maybe tried WSL1 and were not suitably impressed, but I've tried WSL2 and it does actually have a lot of improvements over WSL1, almost an immeasurable number of improvements.
Well, it's got the kernel there, and that gives you the entire Linux application binary layer interface. It's much faster. It's so much better in many ways. So it's really going to unlock what you can do on WSL. Now, WSL1 is still pretty feature complete and stable, and it has a lot less overhead than WSL2. So WSL1 is still pretty good. I run WSL1 on my Surface Go, which is a lower resource computer, and it's great there. So for some people, WSL1 will still make sense, but I think for a lot of people, they're going to love WSL2.
Yeah, when I was running WSL1, I had trouble with things like symlinks and other sort of low-level functionality, and I was like, that's interesting. Oh, I remember I was compiling something with Go that had 1 million dependencies, and it had a lot of trouble reading 1 million tiny files.
Yep. Yeah. So the file I/O was a common complaint of WSL1, and there's some best practices you can deploy to improve file I/O when using WSL generally, and that's keeping your files on the Linux side in your Linux file system instead of trying to run them from Mount C, users Hayden, downloads, files. Keeping them inside the WSL container speeds things dramatically, and then you can actually then mount your folder in Windows from WSL using a cool command here. I can show you real quick. So if you wanted to we'll open Explorer. And I wanted to mount my Ubuntu image. It's just //WSL $Ubuntu. And there you go. So you can then take this and take my home folder from my Linux side right here and mount it. So all my files are kept on the Linux side, and I'm just browsing them from Windows. here, right?
I think
So
With WSL2, didn't they also add like you can just run Explorer from Bash?
Right. You can do explorer.exe and it will open that up.
Something seems wrong about that, but also cool.
Yeah, right. Well, the funny thing is that the file sharing is done by NinePlan, the NinePlan file server. So people who are operating systems nerds like me might be impressed by that.
It is sort of fun and exciting. I mean, so this is you're the developer advocate, I guess, but you also like you've got your hands dirty with this basically every day, and so everybody that's got every use case under the sun is probably coming to you, so you get to see a lot of how people are actually using this and getting stuff done. Has like what are your experiences with that? Have you seen? Because like I can't help but notice that Microsoft, for example, has gotten a lot better. They've got the new terminal, which is not a completely unusable terminal, which is like the first time ever in the history of Windows. Help but think that they're learning just as much from you guys, but I mean that dynamic's got to be interesting across the board.
Well, that the old Windows terminal seems familiar because it's the same Windows terminal that has been there the entire time. It is. It's the same one. And the old Windows terminal programs could actually slow down because of rendering text to the terminal. You could actually minimize the old terminal and it would speed up the process because it wasn't rendering text to the screen, which was taking too long with the legacy code. The great thing about the new Windows terminal is it's 3D accelerated and is super fast. It makes WSL seem faster because it just is.
Yeah, it's like we're not waiting on things to draw. Yeah, no, I remember doing a bunch of robocopies with a bunch of small files, and it was like, let me just minimize this so it goes faster.
Mm-hmm.
That was a thing.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, for operating system architecture.
Yeah. Well, I see a lot of use cases, WSL. I see a lot of web development. I see a lot of sysadmin work. I see a lot of cross compilation. I'm increasingly seeing data science, cloud management, sysadmins who administer Windows and Linux infrastructure like on site. It's useful to have both, in a Surface tablet they can pick up and go with. But yeah, so the cool thing about the Windows terminal is that it actually required Microsoft to open source a core component of Windows, Conhost. The old Conhost is still in Windows, but there's an open source version in the Windows terminal that handles some of that low-level communication with the operating system. And it's kind of cool to think that not only did Microsoft release an open source terminal, but they actually open sourced part of their operating system to make it work too.
The world didn't end.
Exactly.
Rivers didn't flow backwards. Nothing caught on fire. They didn't lose all their intellectual property or whatever. So yeah, that is exciting. It is exciting to see them embrace change. Getting a little off topic, but also things like embracing OpenSSH for remote, and PowerShell is getting to be an almost not unusable command line environment. But you mentioned like the web development workflows and that kind of thing. That's something that I have a lot of experience with, and things, just little basic quality of life things like having to use AWS CLI and development of remote but not actually remote systems has improved dramatically over the last year or two. I mean, Visual Studio Code even has integration for WSL2 now, doesn't it?
Sure. I'd be glad to show that real quick. It's really nifty. Let me do my full screen. So I have code running here, and code is an editor, and it has some great extensions, which increasingly are turning it into an IDE. But there's a great extension called Remote WSL. It is published by Microsoft, and you enable it and you install it in code, and you have this little green button down here called Open a Remote Window. You click that, and I want to say I'm going to open a new window using a distro. I've got Ubuntu installed. Click that. And it will now open a new code editor inside WSL, so that if I go to open a folder, when it's done loading, it will give me the home directory of my Ubuntu distribution. So you can spend all day here coding in Linux, in WSL, in code, and all from your Windows machine. So it's pretty nifty.
Yeah, things like IO notify and stuff like that will work properly in that scenario too, won't it?
Most of the time. There's some edge cases. This is new technology, and WSL2 is new. Most of the time, that will work pretty well. There are some edge cases.
I tripped over a lot of those edge cases in V1, but the nice for anybody watching that's not in the know, IO Notify is a really nifty feature where if you've got if you're working on a complicated web project, you might have things watching what you're doing. And so you might have a SAS compiler watching your CSS, and you might have something else watching your JavaScript to minify your JavaScript, and then you might have something else that's just automatically reloading your project as you do development. It's really an awesome development workflow because you don't have to really leave the IDE. You can just watch your other monitors and your application's updating and changing as you go, which is really awesome. And if you get hooked in with the debugger and you step through a form or a multi-step process, you can actually set a breakpoint and then go back in time and then make a change and just watch that. But most of the magic of that is IO Notify, because if those processes had to watch the entire code base, they would be slow and unusable. But IO Notify means that as you make one change to one specific file, the thing that's responsible for that file notices only that change and can apply it to memory, so it's actually really, really fast. And that was one of the transformative things in WSL2. It seems to work a lot better for me in WSL2, and it's ooh, this is actually not terrible.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I appreciate any and all of your contributions on that. It's always nice to connect with the development team, because I sometimes when I'm doing this kind of work for people, I refer to myself as a computer janitor, and that is the level of appreciation that we feel at times. So I'm sure you have it too. So thank you for being the computer janitor of WSL and making it run a little better.
Well, I try. I'm on the Ubuntu team, so we build Ubuntu for WSL. We make sure our distribution works well. We smooth around upgrade issues and that kind of thing. We then collaborate very closely with the WSL engineering team at Microsoft, who builds the underlying platform that we run on. So it is a constant collaboration, and things like tiny edge cases like IO Notify not working correctly, comes up, and the great resource for those is on GitHub on the WSL issues page. So if you run into an issue, searching there for an existing issue before starting a new one can be really useful, because there will be some tweaks and workarounds that you have to use at times. But most of the time it works out of the box, increasingly so, especially with WSL2.
Nice. Is there anything else about the technology or anything else that you can think of that doesn't get enough airtime, or anything that's this feature is amazing and no one has noticed it yet, or anything like that?
I really like the architecture of it all. WSL1 is a binary translation layer. It parses Linux ELF binaries and translates the low-level system calls to NT system calls. And WSL2 is awesome too. It basically virtualizes the Linux kernel in a basically a very lightweight VM. But I think both technologies are actually really cool. If you think about it, a binary translation layer. I mean, BSD has one for Linux applications. The Windows NT on Alpha, had a binary translation layer for Intel applications.
Older Macs had that for when they moved to Intel. They could still run that.
Yep, they had Classic, and then they had big fat binaries that ran both. So I'm a big fan. I'm a nerd about the architecture. Some of the cool features that people might not know about are the ability for your C drive is automatically mounted. So it's just there, and you can easily access your Windows files from WSL. And you can really do some really nifty automation on your system. I never thought I would run Windows maintenance scripts in Bash, but I do from WSL. So it's kind of like Raspberry Pi in that here's this thing, and we don't really necessarily tell you what to go do with this thing, but you can build what you want out of it. So if you want to build a web development stack, that's really easy to do. If you want to use it to run Linux application, GUI Linux applications that talk to hardware, it's a little more complicated. It's possible, but you can do it.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about WSL, or do you want to, what do you do for fun? Play games? Just, hack on the internals? And it's like, no, you don't understand. This is my fun, because that's kind of like me sometimes.
Yeah, so it's been weird. So I had a whole other job before, and Linux was always my hobby, and it became kind of a side project that then became a business around WSL. And then I ended up going to work for Canonical. So working on this full time. So my hobby became my job. And that can be a little challenging at times because then when you're done for the day, what do you do, right?
You're never done.
You have to go find something else. So I built a Rock Pro build, and I'm taking I found an old VMS book that I've been going through, So I'm still sticking to my old, obscure operating systems and making operating systems do things they're not supposed to do in my free time hobby. But in the meantime, I get out and talk about Ubuntu on WSL, help developers on WSL, oversee the engineering effort. I've got a really great team at Canonical that helps me produce Ubuntu on WSL. So in terms of my fun, I play games with my daughter. She was into Minecraft. She's bounced over to Roblox right now. And I'm thinking of using it as an opportunity to teach her a little bit of Lua scripting, which is pretty extensive in Roblox. Roblox actually runs on Ubuntu, by the way. So that's pretty fun. But yeah, so I think we're all having to find new hobbies now, especially with everything going on.
Yeah. It's a handful. That's kind of the story about a hobby sort of transforming things. That's kind of my experience with Level 1. It's been a hobby, but it's sort of taken off, and then it's like a whole other thing. But I use the crap out of Linux in my career, and convenience and just sort of getting out of the way and letting me do compute and that kind of thing is what I really like about Linux. And anything that directly or indirectly makes Linux more powerful or more flexible, because it's like, there's a lot of people that are like, no, I must use only the most open of open source, and I have a little bit more pragmatic approach. But you talk about obscure operating systems. If we're ever at a convention together, or we're ever going to be in the same city, I've got the perfect project. So I've got the first Unix system that I ever touched. Well, one of the first. Well, not really. I mean, because I was using Linux kind of early on, but when I got to college, it was like, use this thing for real. I was using Linux a little bit before I got to college, but it was VMS. It wasn't Open VMS.
Okay.
So it's a VAX, and that's the quirks and weirdnesses. Having sort of started out on Linux a little bit, has always stuck with me, because it's like, this doesn't seem right. I don't understand. Why is Linux better than the university system? I don't understand. This is kind of, I've got a bright orange VAX vacuum, and I want to put OpenVMS in it. We're going to mod it into a computer. You and me, we can get this done. It's going to be amazing.
Sure. I saw someone tweet into my feed the other day that they had ported Mercurial, which is a version control system before Git, to OpenVMS. And I'm like, okay. Yeah, I got a cool book.
Life goals.
Yeah. So I've got a cool book that I just got, Unix for VMS users. So I'm using it as my reverse, kind of a reverse Rosetta Stone to learn VMS using Unix code. But I was a huge fan of BOS back in the day.
Yeah.
Haiku is coming together pretty well. Uh, it's about to reach, I think, its second beta. I have tons of little ideas like that
Well,
we can have fun with.
having an open VMS machine and a VAX vacuum is amazing because nothing sucks like a VAX.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, you gotta have the hobbies, especially in quarantine, to keep your sanity. I mean, that's just how it goes, right?
Right. Sure.
So, what about long term for WSL? I mean, you mentioned you've got a great team, and you guys are always working on stuff. And I know probably NDAs and can't disclose anything or whatever. But what do you see sort of as the ideal? What do you see in like the 1 year future? What do you see in like the 5 year future?
So I came to WSL a few years ago after growing frustrated with Apple hardware and kind of the lack of flexibility of the Apple platform. And what WSL gave me was a balance of mainstream commercially supported software like Office and a powerful terminal. And I think at this point, WSL is now more powerful than the terminal on macOS. You just have an incredible, I mean, Homebrew is great. You can get Homebrew on WSL too, but then you can get all of the other packages as well from different distros. So if you want to use apt or you want to use DNF or you want to use Zipper, all of those, you can get packages your way from your preferred distro. There are more features coming to WSL. Microsoft Build is in just a little over 2 weeks, or a little under 2 weeks. And there will be new features announced there that people will like. And I think, and if you saw the commercial for the new Surface book.
Oh yeah, it had the terminal in it.
Had the Linux terminal. Microsoft is advertising Linux on its flagship devices, right?
Well, it's the year of the Linux desktop after all. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
Let's not open that can of worms.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I think we're going to see is continued feature development on WSL to where the experience of running WSL is on par with the experience of running the terminal on bare metal. I mean, I think we're getting there, and that you're going to be able to do more. It's going to open up more use cases, and for people for whom this hybrid makes sense, this will get more powerful, and it's going to. There's things that people have done with WSL that I didn't. People are doing software-defined radio work with WSL. And I'm like, I never saw that coming. I just never imagined that. And people are using it to program FPGAs, programming their own silicon with WSL. So it's really hard for me to predict what people are going to do with it. But we are going to continue pushing WSL to be on par with bare metal and have all of those features there, so that if you want to, do audio work, that's something we've looked at doing. If you want to do 3D acceleration, that's something we've looked at. So there are things on the table that we can that we're working on.
Nice. Yeah, the 3D acceleration and some of the access to hardware and that kind of thing. I mean, virtualization, Windows virtualization on a Linux host is probably the way that I have the most Linux mileage for probably the last 10 years. I used the VMware Workstation in Unity mode when they supported that. They don't really support that anymore. It's not really a thing with the Linux host. And I briefly flirted with it a little bit with VirtualBox, but again, it's sort of flaky and kind of thing. And then also like Cubes OS supported that with Windows 7 in sort of a seamless mode. And Cubes is like sort of the ultra paranoid. They don't believe in things like 3D acceleration because of the potential security issues, because they're that paranoid about security, which is fine.
Right.
But I sort of in seeking the same kind of user experience that you guys have been building, which admittedly is actually pretty good and has improved dramatically over the last couple of years, and is much farther than I ever thought you could get on Windows. I think owing to some improvements in Windows under the hood architecturally.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the same kind of experience coming the other way, going from a Windows host with a Linux or a Linux host with a Windows guest, and being able to do snapshots and roll back and let's try this horrible experiment. Oh, that went horribly wrong. Let's just pretend that never happened and go back in time.
Yeah.
And having a VM for work stuff and having a VM for stuff that needs to be a little bit more secure because, hey, the Cisco VPN client is going to do terrible, terrible things to your network stack, and there's just no undoing that. So we might as well just relegate that to a virtual machine. I think
Right.
that a lot of the technologies like WSL on remote will also improve those kinds of experiences as well. Do you know this? Do you know how Lotus 123, like the battle of like Microsoft Excel and Lotus 123?
No, tell me.
So with Lotus 123, Microsoft was doing Excel, and Excel got really good. Like Excel turned into an actual legit product, but it wasn't really being adopted in the marketplace as quickly as Microsoft would have hoped. And Lotus 123 was still sort of the dominant spreadsheet program. So the magic feature that they added, and they didn't mean to, is accidental, at least as described by people inside Microsoft at the time, was the ability to save as 123. So the business types were saying, look, we've got a tiny, sub 10% market share for Excel. We've got to hang tenaciously onto that. We cannot give these people the ability to save as 123. We're going to lose more market share. We're going to lose what little ground we've gained. And then on the, in the reality side, when they actually finally added that feature after like 3 or 4 major versions of Excel, 123 was gone overnight. And the reason is that everybody could safely buy Excel and be like, I can still save as 123. I'm not trapped, but I can also send this to anybody who's still using 123. But immediately overnight, within a year, Lotus was gone. And
Right.
so I kind of like, is that kind of thing going to play out with Microsoft really well supporting Linux, or the other way around? Are we going to see Windows live in a hardware accelerated virtual machine with 3D acceleration and everything that you described? And it's like, I don't know which one it is. I'm sort of pushing for the virtual machine side, but then on the other side, it's like the other thing. Go ahead.
That's interesting. So, here's an interesting parallel. Microsoft Word has supported OpenOffice files since 1997, and it certainly hasn't hurt OpenOffice or LibreOffice. I increasingly see kind of the runtimeification of Linux and Windows. I mean, Microsoft just announced Kubernetes clusters, Kubernetes containers of Windows Server. So, which Linux has been for a long time. I'm increasingly seeing where the operating system is mattering less and less, and what you're actually starting is a hypervisor.
Yeah.
And then your first operating system provides your desktop, but you're actually running multiple operating systems. So, I boot Ubuntu and load the workstation, and I have a GNOME desktop, and I'm running mostly Linux applications. But then I have my little project on the side to run Office on Ubuntu, and it's running in a very tiny, optimized runtime of Windows. And it's kind of the flip of that in Windows. You're booting Windows first. You're actually booting Hyper-V first, then booting Windows. Then when you get into Windows and after you have your display and your desktop, you're then booting Linux again in a window. So the good news is that as WSL growth has exploded, so has Ubuntu desktop. They're both surging right now. So I am not super concerned with WSL taking away market share from Ubuntu desktop. What I encourage people to think about is how many different ways people use Linux, and that Linux desktop is just one slice. It's a big slice, but there's also server, IoT, robotics, embedded, mobile. Um, so what we're doing is just adding another slice to that pie that's going to be those weirdos who run Linux on Windows. Um, and that's and we're so we're growing the pie. We're not taking away from any other side of that, and that's confirmed by our internal data. So the we're going to start to see, now there's going to be a secondary effects of that where you have people submitting bug reports to your software who are running it on WSL. So there's going to, they're going to get commits. I mean, I know a Linux kernel developer who uses WSL. So there's going to be secondary effects of having people collaborating in the ecosystem that is going to benefit everyone else.
And I definitely agree with that, and also expertise, because it's not. It is you're. I couldn't agree more that it's not really a market share thing. Just having people that are familiar with Ubuntu Desktop and WSL, or Ubuntu through WSL, raises that level of expertise. So it's not quite so foreign. It's not quite so whatever. So somebody that is comfortable using the command line or utilities or anything like that is going to have an easier time adopting another operating system. And I think it ultimately is less operating system specific in the future because you have the skill set sort of across the board.
Yep. And, increasingly Windows developers or Windows admins are expecting to have some WSL experience, and that, now don't try to tell Linux admins that they need to have a little Windows experience. But it's good. It's bringing more people into the ecosystem. It's making people more comfortable with the Linux command line. And, I've kind of said this before, you shouldn't have to learn what a swap partition is to use Nano. Like, let's teach Nano first. Let's get people comfortable with, well, I was going to say regex and sed, but maybe that's not the first step. but let's get people building applications on the command line. And then, when they need to provision a VPS, they can learn what partitioning and swap and all of those things are. So we're trying to lower the barrier to entry to these skills. We see huge adoption of WSL in universities, where before, the students that could afford Apple hardware had, Bash. I think now they've got Dash instead of Bash. And, the kids with Windows laptops had to run a VM if their computer was powerful enough. But now anyone, especially with WSL 1, which has a kind of lower overhead, can, have access to a Linux command line within a few clicks running on their computer. So I think that is a breakthrough there, that it's so easy to get to. You don't have to sign up for an online account. You don't have to confirm your email or add a credit card or partition swap or know what partitions are yet. Let's get them hooked on what this little blinky light thing can do after the $sign, and then we'll teach them everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to walk before you can run. I mean,
yeah. Well, my first few years of Linux were struggling to get it to run on hardware, right? And I learned through compiling my own kernel to get it to support my hardware from, editing xorg.conf, like I learned these things. And just because I learned that way doesn't necessarily mean that was the best way to learn, So I really want to make Linux a positive, productive experience for people who are first setting foot in it, not a frustration point, because that'll come. That's there. I mean, that's part of how you learn is being frustrated, but at least getting them in the door, I think this is a good step.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, you never know what's out there until you try it, and then it's like, oh, this might actually be something interesting, and then that may lead to other things sort of down the road, or other more interesting experiences. And
Hmm.
that's a pretty interesting future overall. I mean, it should be good. It should be
Yeah.
good for the future of it should be good for the future of Linux. I think overall, just the adoption and familiarity and the skill set, the engineering know-how.
Yeah.
So
Right. The people who should be worried based on our data is Apple, because we're pulling a lot of Mac OS developers over.
yeah,
Um,
I'm a
you
little
know,
concerned that the Mac OS may be rotting from the inside out because they haven't really put a lot of engineering time into the underbelly of Unix there, and it's from a security standpoint, it may be going to have. My opinion is that I think that they're going to have a major security incident or two, and then they're just going to switch to only running whitelisted walled garden binaries. But that's not really a way to conduct yourself on that kind of a platform.
right. So what then becomes the viable platform for do-it-yourselfers? It becomes Windows and Ubuntu desktop, and I'm fine with that
Yeah,
because you can run Ubuntu both places.
yeah, yeah, and it makes it easier to transfer things like configuration. I mean, Windows does have the user folder, but a lot of my configuration and things like that on Linux, some of it goes back 10 years, and it's been perfectly portable between systems. And I think that's a recipe for disaster trying to bring in your preferences and settings from 10 years, Windows 10 years ago on any kind of modern platform. Instead, it's like, let me just reset it up the new way. Or even
Sure.
things like GNOME widgets. Like, I would love to have some GNOME widgets on Windows that work as well as on GNOME, but that seems like that's not going to happen soon.
Well, I mean,
Maybe.
you can do GUI apps on Windows. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's good that both platforms are now going to be pushing each other on this, and I think Windows is getting better, and I think Ubuntu is up to the challenge. So it. I don't think I don't think we're in that fearful posture anymore. I
Yeah.
think we're in a place now where the default VM on almost every public cloud is Ubuntu. So I think we're going to be okay.
Well, I am really excited. The thing that sort of made me reach out to you was you had the Twitter post where you have a seamless Windows application running on what appears to be an Ubuntu desktop background, and it's like, oh, that's exciting for the future. That right there, that's my use case.
Yeah. Well, we hear from a lot of Ubuntu desktops, particularly in the enterprise, that they are interested in still having Office, even on their Ubuntu workstations for their developers and that kind of thing. And yeah, I had some ideas about how that might work, and I threw it together and made a video out of it and posted it on Twitter. And I didn't think anyone would care. I actually posted a video a while ago of it, and it only got like 30 likes, right? And then, but the one of Word and then Excel
Yeah.
running that blew people's minds. So
Listen, I harass the guys on VMware once a year. I've got a calendar entry. It pops up, and I go to Twitter, and it's like, "Hey, did you re-enable Seamless yet for VMware?" No, and there's usually like 70 likes and like 40 replies that are like, "Yeah, we need that," and they're just like, mute,
right,
delete, delete. So there's definitely a lot of people out there that are excited for that. I mean, in the enterprise, not just Word and Excel. I mean, I've done some consulting where I've gotten an old Windows application to work under like Wine. And then it's like as soon as that's a thing and as soon as I'm under a service contract to provide support, that they're just like, yes, this is amazing. We can abandon ship. We don't have to migrate from Windows 7 to Windows 10. We can just go straight to Linux, and now we can lock it down. We can audit our systems better, blah, blah, blah. For their use case, it was like amazing, except for this one legacy Windows application they had developed like 15 years ago that they still use, that still runs their enterprise. And they're like, no, we're not going to port it. We're not going to do anything. And it's like, well, it's so old, it'll probably almost work under Wine. And it turns out that it does.
yeah, yeah.
So,
So those things. I think the primary goal needs to be moving native applications to Linux. I mean, we've got Skype, we've got Teams coming, we've got Edge. Teams is there, Snap is coming. We've got We know Edge is coming, which I think is a great browser. Um, Azure Storage Explorer, PowerShell, Azure CLI. I want to bring more of those over because I really think that for Linux desktop is key. But for those edge cases, for those one application or two that aren't going to be ported, I think virtualization, some sort of hybrid containerization, virtualization, um, is exciting. So I'm going to keep working on that. I'm going to be working on that on the side. I have a book to write right now, but that'll be done, and then I'll have time to uh, port access to.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. No, some of our most popular content on Level 1 has been, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, and one of the things that sort of helped make Level 1 a little more than a hobby was our like VFIO guides and running a Windows VM, but passing through a full GPU to the Windows VM for acceleration.
Mhm.
And now, community members like Jeff McRae have written software like called Looking Glass, which is a frame buffer to frame buffer copy, a GPU to GPU copy, basically. So you can run Windows in a VM with a physical GPU and then copy the entire frame buffer with a memory to memory transfer to the other GPU. And so you still have a Windows VM, but with full 3D acceleration, play games at 100 FPS if you want. And it's a Linux host with a Windows VM, but there's no the biggest downside is just the headache of setting that up and having to have a dummy plug connected to the if it's a gaming graphics card, it's like, oh, I'm not going to operate correctly unless I really have a monitor plugged in, and it's like, okay, so you plug in an EEPROM basically to the thing. It's not even a real display, or you can use a secondary display or whatever. And a lot of people have that use case, or at least it's the long tail of the internet, right? So everybody that wants to do that has found their way to those guides, and that was something that surprised me personally in the same way that you were surprised by your Twitter post. It's like, wow, a lot of people out there are using this use case. That's a little surprising, but also kind of cool.
Yeah. 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 I'm not sure about frame buffers and all that. That sounds out there, but I'm going to look into it.
Well, I'll be glad to help you set up a machine to do that because it's really cool.
Sure.
I mean, there's a couple high-speed videos that I did where one display I was using was high refresh, and we were able to pull the frame out of the frame buffer on the card and display it on the Linux monitor before the Windows monitor physically had a chance to do it, because it only refreshes once every 16 milliseconds, and we were able to beat that 16 milliseconds timer on the other display, which is kind of mind-blowing. It's like it's faster than native. I mean, not really, but kinda.
That's great. That's awesome.
So yeah, that's the future. That's why I was really excited about what you were doing, and it was like, okay, I got to talk to you. Let's do this interview. Let's see what have you got cooking. Will I learn more about that in like 2 weeks, or more than 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks? With the developer conference thing.
Oh no, it won't be at Build. Yeah, this is just a side project of mine. In the next few months, it depends on. Let's see if any big enterprise clients saw my video, and if they if they come calling, that can help things move along faster. And if anyone is listening and wants to convince their CTO to license this, they should get in touch with Canonical.
Well, it's the $100 Windows license is cheaper than the $300 VMware Workstation license that I had back in the day. So,
well, yeah, my idea was that for users converting to Ubuntu Desktop, they would use their existing Windows or Office license that they have on site. But I also have like 8 or 9 old PCs with Windows 7 and 8 stickers on them, and all of those work. Yeah. So it's not hard to find Windows. You don't have to crack Windows. And then we also had another thing people might be interested in since they're watching YouTube is we had WSL Conf in March, and we converted at the last minute to a virtual event. It was March 10th and 11th, so it was right before most of the country started going into shutdown. But we have some really great videos from WSL Conf, and that's on the Celebrate Ubuntu YouTube page. And if you're interested in what people are doing on WSL, everything from programming embedded devices to writing Go applications to front end, back end, some security on there. I was talking to a CTO of a major health system late last week, and they're moving some of their infrastructure to Ubuntu and deploying workstations. And he used WSL to train his existing Windows technicians on Linux.
Nice.
The one of my favorite stories is that when DICE, which is a studio of EA, was writing the Frostbite engine, which powers, Madden, Star Wars Battlefront 2, the new one. I remember the old Battlefront 2, right? So, but the new one, FIFA, that Frostbite engine. So the developers that were Windows C++ developers, but they wanted to build the back end in Linux. So they used WSL basically to take existing Windows C++ developers and turn them into Linux developers. And now the back end of all of those games, when you go and play those games, the container that's hosting your game on the server is running on Ubuntu. So there's some really cool things out there that people have done with WSL. So
where can they find you on Twitter? Or do you want to plug any like social media links or anything like that?
Sure. I'm at Unix Terminal. I post photos from old Unix magazines if you're interested. I've been going through, in part of quarantine hobby, I've been going through old Unix magazines and journals from the 80s and 90s and basically finding examples of DOS and NT interoperability with early Unix and like showing this is nothing new. People have been doing this all the time. But in the meantime, I've also come across some really cool ads, like vaporwave ads from the 80s that I put up there. And so I try to post fun stuff on Twitter that people might be interested in. Let's see, where else can they find me? I'm in the WSL IRC channel on Freenode. You can, I'm around. So yeah, I mean, so on Reddit, the WSL subreddit is still r-bash on Ubuntu on Windows. I monitor that. And if you have questions, you can always ping me and I will redirect you to the right place. Sometimes that's, the WSL page. Sometimes that's, the Ubuntu, page on landscape, to file bugs. If you ever have questions about, where do I go to get help with this issue on WSL, I can help be a router for that.
Well, hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah, sure.
This is a lot of fun. I'm Wendell. This is Level 1. I'm signing out. And you can find me at the Level 1 forums. See you later.